is the Managing Director and co-founder of Bunnyfoot, and tonight he will be looking forward by looking backwards. Please put your hands together for Jon Dodd.
Trying to think about a good and appropriate topic to talk to you about tonight. And I thought, bearing in mind this is our 7th year now, it'd be good to have a kind of retrospective of where we've gone to and where we've come from and where we're heading, but also combine that with some other aspects as well. First, an intro to me, though, thinking about kind of what's happened in the past and how that's directed the future from a personal point of view. I used to be an academic, and we had various successes messing about with kind of facial attractiveness and facial models. And this was a thing that was produced in 1992. It took £80,000 worth of silicon graphics computers and about 3 days to compute. It took my face, which was that one there. You can see it's quite a long time ago, looking back. And that's my face, 18% more female in shape. This is 18% more female in colour, and this is 18% more female in shape and colour. Of course, this was revolutionary at the time, but now you get it on all your mobile phones, and we do this to mess about in Snapchat and everything else, so how times change. After I was an academic there, I spent 6 years studying this thing. This was still doing all this neuroscience research. This is a bimodal, bistable visual illusion. Just a show of hands, how many people are seeing it going around that way? Show of hands. And how many people are seeing it going the other way? Yeah, brilliant. So you're seeing the same thing, but half of you are seeing it going that way, half of you are seeing it going the other way. And at some point, it will flip for you as well. Oh, a bit of a discussion about it. That's great. So I spent 6 years of my life studying this thing, and I was trying to find out the neural correlates of the big choice decision that you make that determines whether you see it going that way or that way. So 6 years of my life was spent having people sit in front of this, doing psychometric tests and all sorts of things. And after that 6 years, you have to write a book, which is your PhD, but the culmination of that 6 years worth of work says the number of brain cells out of your 18 billion brain cells and all the glial cells and all the wet stuff that goes on in your brain as well, the number of cells that determines whether you see it going that way or that way is, wait for it, this was 6 years of my life, by the way, somewhere between 2 and 57. 6 years of my life for that. So I wanted to do something a bit more productive with my life. So I took some of the skills that we generated from testing things, doing psychology, testing people in front of stuff and their interpretations, and formed a company in 1999. So 20 years ago, we formed Bunnyfoot. We were a usability and accessibility agency, and that basically meant assessing the kind of new world of the internet, or everyone kind of throwing stuff up there online in this kind of new world, and assessing them against known principles of interaction, and also user testing people, and making sure that we fixed mistakes that they'd made. This is a very worthwhile exploit, of course. Fixing mistakes and fixing errors gives you competitive advantage. It makes you slightly better than the rest and everything. And that's all good, and we still do quite a lot of that now. But ultimately, it's rather kind of fruitful and not that kind of, it's not that good for the soul. Because what you're doing essentially is endlessly polishing people's turds. And you might create like really shiny turds, but you're not creating the real big thing up here, which is what we're celebrating today, which is, great UX and great experience. So how do you do that? Rather than just fix stuff that's broken by testing it and just putting, sticking plasters over it, how do you actually create something that's truly great? Well, you've got to inform all of that with some part of process. So user-centered design, research, good UX practice. So we actually wanted to celebrate good UX practice 7 years ago and actually reward those, which is you people, for doing a great job of that. So we formed these in 2012, and as John said already, this is our seventh version tonight. So just a quick retrospective, looking back at our past winners. In 2013, it was Transport for London. It's kind of interesting to note that this was fantastic in its day. And how many people use Transport for London now? So still quite a lot as well. And of course, there's all sorts of other avenues as well, just directly from Google and all of those kind of things as well. But still a great product. BBC Sport, how many people are still using BBC Sport? Fantastic, isn't it? So if you put the good practice in there, these things have longevity. FutureLearn was a great kind of new concept, very small budget, but a great team and a great process. They won in 2015. 2016, anyone heard of this? It's fantastic service design around sexual health and getting over certain difficulties with approaching and gaining good service with sexual health. The Beano, everyone heard of the Beano? So Beano was our winner in 2017. This was a real kind of revamp using insight, user-centered design, and great practice to kind of reboot what the Beano is and should be. And indeed, they were our keynote speaker the year after. Fantastic practice. If you want to read that, see it on the UXUK site. And last year was Calm Harm, which was a fantastic app which reported a 93% reduction in people self-harming themselves through using of an app. So we can see from selling stuff to having sport to getting our wayfinding with transport to reducing or increasing our sexual health and reducing our self-harm. These are all really great endeavours. So who's going to win tonight? Don't know. We'll get there in a second. But first, I'm just going to share with you some aspects about looking back to look forward, more forward on the future. I've been speaking today, it's a couple of hours ago, at this conference, Designing for the Future. And I thought I'd just share with you some of the things that I talked about at that. The whole purpose was to look at universal design principles in order to inform what the future might be, but not forgetting what the past humane principles were that govern how we react psychologically and behaviorally with all these kind of new interactions that will be there in the future. So that's what I was talking on. I gave a workshop and people took various different principles. This is live from a couple of hours ago, and they were creating in their groups their own design principles and then sharing those with each other, and then using those principles that they generated from first principles in order to assess various different interactions that they were having around the conference centre. Things like coffee machines and doors and all of that kind of stuff, as well as apps and everything else. So that was cool. What we also looked at was actually how the future will be shaped by what we're doing at the moment, and all those areas of unpredictability and what the future might be. It's very hard to predict the future with any degree of certainty, but by looking back and thinking about that knowledge that we've got from existing HCI psychology, cognitive psychology, etc., how we as humans behave, kind of restricts this kind of future possibility cone somewhat, so that we can, although we don't know what the future is going to be in terms of technology and various different socio-economic, political aspects, to a certain extent for design, we've got more of a bearing on what might be the possible future. So this can provide us with a lodestone for that. So I want to share with you just something that I think will be useful to you all as purveyors of great UX. That's why you're in this room. And it might be useful for you to continue on that same path. So what I'm actually going to be talking about briefly, and what I was teaching at this afternoon, was really these things, which are high-level principles. So there are all sorts of kind of guidance and style guides and all sorts of information you can get about how to design for stuff, how to design for interaction, how to design for mobile, how to design for voice, how to design for the Internet of Things and everything else that you find as well. And those are all great, and they can help us to a certain extent, but once you start to get even to the pattern level, and you get to specific kind of design guidelines and specific OS level or device-specific level of guidance, those levels are quite volatile, because as technology changes, as design changes, as style changes, as culture changes, all of these things will have to be updated. So they're very volatile, and it's quite difficult to always keep track of those. Indeed, you can see by looking back how even our aesthetic sensibilities have changed in 5 or 10 years in terms of what we're looking at. If you look at when the iPhone was first launched, have a look at that interface now. It looks so dated, even though it was so revolutionary at the time. So although those kind of stylistic things change, oh God, Android was just a pit, whereas now it's really, really good. So all of those things will change and be updated, but actually the fundamental principles, these things, that govern whether they're going to be a success or not, remain invariant. And that's kind of what we want to look at, or what's useful to look at as designers, because if you learn a limited number of things here that are based on human needs, human interaction, human-computer interaction, psychology, behavior, and everything else, these will remain useful no matter what the future brings. So I just want to share with you a little bit of that. And they're good because they're based on who we are, and we don't change as much as the technology that we interact with will. So a bit of a pop quiz for you all here first. There's been some writers and some kind of leading thinkers and gurus even in this domain. I'm going to think about some, particularly with respect to kind of web usability and early software. So I'm going to show you some pictures, and I want you to shout out if you recognize who they are, and just shout out their name for me. So you should all know these people. I'm going to do an easy one first. Ready? Anyone? Nielsen. Who recognises this? Jakob Nielsen. So an influential writer about web usability. So some people take with a pinch of salt now what he says, but actually he made a massive contribution in 1990. His contribution was the usability heuristics, which are still well used now, even though it's 30 years on. He also invented discount usability techniques, which is the precursor of lean and those kind of things that we do now. Okay, the next one. I hope you all know this guy. Who's this? Don Norman. Don Norman's like the Gandalf of UX and usability. He's a real kind of guiding light for everything else. He's a shareholder and early advisor in Google and Apple and kind of everything else as well. How about this guy? Anyone? No, you must know this guy. Steve Krug. So he's the writer of the really influential book, Don't Make Me Think. So if you haven't come across him, or if you're trying to convince people to invest in usability and UX, buy the book, Don't Make Me Think, have a quick read, and give it to them. It's really useful. And finally, this guy, a bit more difficult, a bit more challenging for you. Jared Spool, so the owner and operator of User Interface Engineering. Again, a good writer and thinker. All a bit old school, but actually a lot of what they were writing about and a lot of what they're saying is very relevant today. I'm just going to focus on Don Norman because I think he's the he's the one that I admire the most out of these lot. But there's loads of others as well that come from science, psychology, cognitive psychology, human-computer science, and everything. If you're going to get a bit geeky about this, we'll post this up somewhere. Have a look at all of these different guidelines. What you'll find is, particularly, probably the best one actually is Sneederman there. If you adhere to all of those principles, you'll probably create something that's going to be pretty good. Indeed, when the judges and when the pre-judging was happening for the UXUK Awards, what we were doing was assessing the interfaces and the submissions against a number of these different criteria and principles. I'm just going to show you some of Don Norman's. I really like, the sentiment that he expresses here. Design is a communication between the designer and the user, except, all you've got is the device, what you put in the device itself. So that's got to be great. It's got to be, really easy to learn, easy to communicate, and guide you through the way. These are Norman's kind of 7 interaction principles. The great thing about these is all you have to learn is these 7 things, and they will guide you in terms of evaluating design, or indeed if you're responsible for designing something. If you think about these and use these as your fundamental kind of guiding lights, as long as you adhere to them, you're likely to create something that's good. If you've got something that's a bit dodgy and you want to kind of check it out, it's probable that it violates one or more of these principles. I'll just go through them very, very quickly. Visibility. Can the thing that you've got to interact with be easily seen and perceived? So our links obvious, our buttons obviously pressable, those kind of things. Affordance, just the physical nature of something actually inform its use. These are things like handles of jugs and those kind of things. Signifiers, just the visual form of something tell you how it's going to work. So it's something peeking above that tells you can swipe it, those kind of things. Do you get a one-to-one mapping of cause and effect? Light switches tend to violate this thing because you don't know, where the lights are on the switch you're about to press. Constraints, does the design of something stop you making errors? Feedback, when you do something, do you get an immediate response that tell you that that's okay and it's been done? And consistency, when it worked over there, does it also work the same over here? Does every single page of your website, your app or whatever, work in the same way? Jacob Nielsen had a really good point on this. He said, if you've got a website, you should realize that 99.9% of your customer or your user's time is spent not on your website, it's on all of the other ones. So it's useful to adhere to some consistent standards in delivering yours as well. So don't innovate for innovate's sake when it's not necessary. Has anyone read this book? Yeah, it's a fantastic book, written in 1998. So it was called first The Psychology of Everyday Things, and then they funked it up a bit and called it The Design of Everyday Things. In that, Donald Norman wrote about all of those principles and those things that I've just shown you. And this was 1988, so what's that, 31 years ago. He brought out a new edition in 2013. And the interesting thing about this is if you think about that 25 years difference between the first version and the second version, what had happened in those 25 years? Pretty much, the internet and touch and mobile and everything that we know and interact with today had happened in that intervening year. But all he had to update in that book, pretty much, was some of the pictures to make them more relevant. And actually, he funked up the design so it would sell better. It was really dated. So it tells you something about the truism of those fundamental principles when this massive revolution that affects all of our lives, massively, has happened today, if all he has to do is update the pictures, then you know that there's something in that and there's something really true about it. And you can look to others as well in terms of getting your design inspiration. So, people are often kind of myopic on design, or they read Medium or all these other sources about kind of web design and everything else. I think it's good to take a step back and look at other design disciplines as well. So I covet one of these chairs. They're about $6,000 or whatever, and I could probably afford one if I really saved up. But there's no point, I've got cats, so it's just going to ruin it. Until they die, I'm not going to be able to get one of these chairs, unfortunately. But Charles and Ray Eames, kind of espoused these great design principles. Indeed, they formulated some universal design principles as well. So this was for product, this was for furniture design, but we can equally supply or apply some of those to our UX designs. I want to quickly take you through one of my kind of heroes from even further back, so the 1950s. So does anyone know who this is? David Ogilvy. So of Ogilvy and then Ogilvy and May, the advertising agency. To my mind, he was like the original UX designer, if you like. He did things that we are still doing today, even though you probably don't recognize that they came from that source. Really interesting character if you want to kind of investigate him. In 1935, he became, all sorts of things happened in his life, but in 1935, he became an Arga salesman at age about 24, I think he was. He wrote a fantastic book about the art of selling, the Arga. I really encourage you to read it. Bit of a warning, it's quite sexist, so it's 1935, it's quite misogynistic, and all of those kind of things. But if you discount all of that and just take the principles, it's an amazing manual. If you're in the selling business, read that and it will rock your life. It will change everything. What he also did was he was a real great advocate of rules and telling everyone else how to do stuff. So he produced all of these for the general populace and in particular his employees as well. Let's have a look at some of them. So this was 1950s, 1960s. Look at this one, psychological segmentation. Any good agency knows how to position products for demographic segments of the market, for men, for young children. So that's, user-centered design. Let's have a look at some more. Burr of singularity. The average consumer now sees 20,000 commercials a year, poor dear. Most of them slide off her memory like water off a duck's back. Give your commercials flourish of singularity, a bear. One such thing is the mnemonic device. So he was thinking about the brain, and he was thinking about how we can stimulate and use the fundamental principles of memory in order to make their adverts sell more and be memorable more. If we look at some more of these, select your prospect. So this is, again, user-centric. So actually prioritizing your personas, designing for specific people and specific targets. It's all user-centered design. Yes, people read long copy. So this was about people aren't dumb. People will read stuff that's interesting and targeted towards them. So these were just some of the principles. And you'll see that all of this stuff is absolutely relevant to your endeavors today. And he talked about these across all sorts of domains as well. So again, investigate all of this stuff. What he did in his agency is if anyone joined, they had to sit through it was an overhead projector thing called a lantern at the time, which espoused his rules. And if anyone at Ogilvy and Mather disagreed, they were quite forcefully invited to leave. So you did it his way or you took the highway. I'd love it if I could do that to my guys, but they just give it me back. He also talked about, directed sales and effect. So he was into creativity, but also not creativity for creativity's sake. If it didn't do something, and for advertising sell, then it wasn't creative. Right, I'm running over a bit, so I'm just going to flick through some of these other principles very, very quickly. Number one, so this was his magic lantern slides effectively. What you say is more important than how you say it. So it's kind of espoused in this. So the substance is more important than the way it's presented. If you don't get that right, then it's pointless. That's what we all want to do, really. Use something or sell something. So what you say is more important than how you say it. So, you should never rely on guesswork. He was actually one of the first people to use real data and do A/B testing. So this was direct response testing within magazines and newspapers and all sorts of things. He worked with Dr. Gallup of Gallup Polls, really early on. This was in the 50s and the 60s. So data-driven design, effectively. Unless your campaign is built around a great idea, it will flop. One of his quotes was, isn't every client who can recognize a truly great idea when they see it? Who's been affected by hippos here? Highest paid person's opinions, their clients. Yeah, we all have, haven't we? So using data can combat them to a certain extent. Also, just don't copy people. Give the facts. The consumer isn't a moron, she's your wife. I told you about the misogyny kind of thing, but that was the market that he was designing for. Don't insult her intelligence with a mere slogan and a few vapid objectives. How many times have you had designers or people working for you saying, we can't put that much on there, it has to be clean and clear and everything else? Well, it doesn't. It has to have interesting content that they want to read and is going to be relevant to them. One of the most famous kind of embodiments of this is this advert. Anyone seen this before? It's fantastic. Just look at that headline. Look at all of this detail. But actually, for the target market, this is absolutely fantastic. This headline is amazing. He shared this with the chief engineer at Rolls-Royce, and he actually gave this response. But I think that's fantastic. This really sums up what that whole thing was about. So providing content is really good. Being really careful with your wordsmithery. You can't bore people into buying. This was about people who get bombarded with so many messages. So this was in 1963. Just think what we're getting bombarded with now. How do you create distinction now? Be well-mannered, but don't clown. So this is about, the principle of likability, which is a persuasion principle. But don't go overboard. You've got to be really careful in your tone of voice and how you approach these things. Make everything contemporary. This one's hit me a bit, because we've been doing this for 20 years now. I'm now kind of the old and establishment. He recognised this when he got to around about my age as well. It's difficult for a 51-year-old to tune into young married couples just starting out. Equally, once you get to my age, you need to kind of hand it over to the young, funky millennials to design for millennials as well, but still hopefully impart some of your wisdom every now and then. Committees can criticise advertisements, but they cannot create them. How many people have had, design committees designing your app or your function or your service by committee? yeah, it's awful. So he recognised that even then. If you're lucky enough to write a good advertisement, carry on doing it. Don't innovate for innovate's sake. If something's working, carry on. Never write advertisement which you wouldn't want your own family to read. So this is about being truthful, being honest, having integrity, all of those things that we want today. The image and the brand. So this is important about creating a long-term relationship. That's what we're trying to do with UX. And don't be a copycat. I see just loads of things being copycat at the moment out. Any website, they all look the same at the moment because they're all using the same responsive design templates and they all look exactly the same. So we can break this mold if we're going to create great UX. He also had good perspectives on research as well. So this is, again, back in the 1960s. So do your homework. How many times have we talked about whether you need to do usability testing or not? So he was espousing that even then. And I think this one's really useful. Quite often use this one in saying why we should do some of the research as well. He had opinions, as you can imagine. He's a very opinionated bloke on all aspects of research. I haven't really got time to go through these, but using pretentious jargon, we talk about ethnography and all of this kind of thing. We're still doing lots of these today. Now, I could go on, I don't have time, but he does. I'm just going to leave you with some quotations from him. He had headlines and guidelines on copy and headlines and images and all sorts of aspects. So this is about headlines. And he goes on to say, which I think is really useful. This is about how to treat your agency with respect, really. So you pay them a certain commission, and actually it only costs you a small amount to pay them a lot more, but you're going to get so much more back in terms of what they're going to put out for you in advertising. I guess the same applies in UX design as well. This was about never ask your agency to provide you with the end creative before they started work for you. Yeah, let's not do that. And finally, just on life generally, I think that's a really useful thing that we can all kind of play by. So, the conclusion, read those classics, read those old things, particularly when they're kind of human-based, and don't reinvent the wheel, but do update them, and question them, and adapt them for now, and carry on adapting. Perform scrupulous research in all aspects of your endeavours, and probably the most important one, pay your agency more than they ask for, and they will give you more back in return. So, thank you very much.